In 1841, an accountant in Manchester sat down with working families and copied out their weekly accounts, what came in, what went out, line by line. Read those columns today and something strange happens. You can watch a household earn more money than it ever had in the countryside, and you can watch almost every extra shilling disappear into a thing that used to be free. We know almost nothing else about those families. Not their names, not their faces, not what they thought they were doing. They survive as a column of figures in the back pages of a statistical journal. We'll come back for them at the end. Here is the story everyone already has. The countryside emptied. People walked into the manufacturing towns because the towns paid better. And then, depending on which half of the argument you were raised inside, either their lives slowly got better, or they were fed into dark satanic mills and ground down. Both versions are held by serious, careful people. Both versions have been argued for 2 centuries. And both versions are built on the same measurement, what a worker was paid. That measurement is real. It is also the least interesting number in the room. One more thing before we start. The 1st of May, 1848, a Monday, keep it somewhere. We'll need it about 3/4 of the way through, and by the time we reach it, it won't look like a date about factories at all. The wage went up. Every serious reconstruction of the period agrees on that. And the historians who say industrialization eventually raised living standards are not lying to you. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that a family which moved from a village to a manufacturing town had to start buying 4 things it used to make: its food, its cloth, its fuel, and someone to watch its children. The wage did not rise because the family was winning. The wage rose because it had to. It rose so the family could stand still. So here is what this is going to show you, specifically. How that conversion put a baker's oven between a woman and a loaf of bread permanently. How it made the national drink of Britain a decision about the price of coal. How it produced a set of numbers in which a laborer in Manchester and a gentleman in Rutland appear to belong to 2 different species. And how the whole thing ended, not in a factory, not in a riot, but in Parliament, arguing about what time it was. That last one is the part nobody sees coming, and it comes from the same place as the rest. Because once you have to buy your bread carries a price. Once you have to buy your coal carries a price. And once you have to sell your day by the hour, the day carries a price too. Everything about survival that had been a matter of weather, skill, season, and family became, in about 2 generations, a matter of transactions. And there is a rhythm to that which is easy to underestimate. A farming household lived by the year. An industrial household lived by the week, and had roughly 6 days of margin before the arithmetic became a crisis. The pawnbrokers' trade in the manufacturing towns ran on a weekly cycle for exactly this reason: the same goods in and out, Monday and Saturday, over and over, and a transaction leaves a mark. In 1841, in a room in Manchester, somebody wrote it down. Before any of this comes apart, you need to see how good the machine was. Not clever. Good. Because if you can't feel why people walk toward it, the ending just sounds like a story about people being stupid, and nobody in this story is stupid. Start with the problem it solved, which was real and very old. A rural household in 18th century England could produce most of what it consumed. It could also produce almost nothing else. Its labor was not idle, exactly, but it was catastrophically underused. A woman spinning by hand through a winter evening was producing value at a rate that would horrify anyone who has ever run a business. Half the year, the fields did not need most of the people standing in them. The town did something that had never been possible before. It turned unusable hours into money. It set a price on labor that had never had a price. And the price was set by what the machinery could do rather than by what a pair of hands could do. That is an enormous thing. For the first time, a family's spare capacity was worth something to somebody who would pay cash for it on a Saturday. And here is the part that gets left out of both the heroic version and the tragic one. A great deal of this was chosen. Households across northwestern Europe had already begun reallocating their own labor toward the market well before the factories arrived. And they did it because they wanted things: tea, sugar, printed cotton, a clock on the wall, a mirror, shoes that were bought rather than made. Historians call it the Industrious Revolution, families sending more of their labor out into the market and pulling more market-made goods back in. The demand came first. The mills arrived to meet a hunger that was already there. And there was a second thing the town offered that the village structurally could not, which almost never gets mentioned. A wage is not attached to the weather. A wet August destroyed a farming household's year, and there was no appeal. A spinning mill paid the same on the wettest August in living memory as on the driest. For families whose grandparents had watched a single bad harvest end them, the idea of an income that simply did not care what the sky was doing was not a small convenience. It was a new category of security, and it was real. There was also the matter of who you answered to. The rural parish was not only a place, it was an authority, in which the people who decided whether your family ate were the same people who had known your family for 3 generations. The town offered a wage that arrived without anybody's approval attached to it. People have walked toward that for the whole of history. So the picture you should be holding is not a countryside of contented peasants dragged into hell. It is a picture of adults making a series of individually sensible decisions. Move where the wage is. Sell the hours that were going to waste anyway. Buy the cloth instead of spending 4 evenings a week making worse cloth. And it worked, in the specific sense that matters to an economist. Across the 50 years to 1,840, British output per worker rose by something like 46%. That is not a rounding error, and it is not propaganda. Sham. A country genuinely learned to produce far more with the same people. Hold that. We're going to need it later, and it has to still be true when we get there. Now follow 1 week's pay all the way through, from the moment it is handed over to the moment there is nothing left of it. Saturday evening. Cash, in a hand, at a pay window. This is already a change so basic, it is easy to miss the agricultural year, paid in lumps, in kind, in harvest, in a hiring fair, once or twice a year. The town pays weekly, in coin. And the week is now the unit of the household's entire existence. The money starts leaving immediately. Rent goes first, weekly, to a collector who comes to the door, because urban landlords learned early that the safest way to be paid by people with no savings is to be paid before anything else. Then coal bought by the hundredweight, or in worse weeks by the scuttle. And here the first quiet penalty appears. Buying fuel in small quantities costs more per unit than buying it in large ones. A household with no storage and no cash reserve pays a permanent surcharge for the privilege of being poor, and pays it every week, forever. Then food, which is where the week actually goes. In a factory worker's household, roughly 60% of everything coming in went straight back out on food. For farm laborers, it ran closer to 75. 6 shillings in every 10, gone before a single other decision could be made, before boots, before a doctor, before anything that could be called a life. But that 60% is not 60% spent on food. It is 60% spent on things sold as food. When the medical press finally put the country's groceries under a microscope in the early 1850s, running some 2,500 analyses, what came back was not a scandal about a few bad actors. It was a description of the ordinary market, a lump in the bread, to whiten flour that had no business being white, water in the milk, used tea leaves, dried, colored, and sold again. The investigators did something almost nobody had done before. They printed the names and the street addresses of the sellers. Let that land. The single largest item in a working family's budget, the one that ate more than half of everything they earned, was an item they could not verify by looking at it. And the fourth purchase? The one that never appears in the household budget columns at all, because it wasn't paid in money? Someone had to watch the children. In the village, that was a grandmother, an older sister, a neighbor, the geography of a place where the work and the house were the same place. In the town, the work was 2 streets away behind a locked gate, and it ran 12 hours. So the week ends where it began. The loaf comes back into the room, and a child takes it, a loaf bought with money earned by hours sold, made of flour the family never saw, ground from wheat they never grew, whitened with something they'd never heard of. Step sideways for a moment, into somewhere you would not expect a wage to reach, the national diet. Ask why the British working class ended up living on bread and tea, and the answers you usually get are about empire and about taste. Neither is the mechanism. The mechanism is the great. Urban housing of this period was built to the smallest dimensions that would still let a family fit inside. Most of it had no oven. What it had was an open fireplace of famous inefficiency, throwing most of the heat it produced straight up the chimney, and every lump of what it burned had been bought. Cooking the kind that turns cheap ingredients into a meal requires a sustained fire held at temperature for an hour or more. In a village where fuel was gathered, that fire was effectively free. In a town where fuel came by the scuttle, that fire had a price per hour, and the price was often higher than the food it was cooking. Baking your own bread stopped making arithmetic sense. What survives that squeeze is the meal you can produce on a fire too small to cook on. Boil water. That is all the fuel budget will carry. So, bread, which somebody else baked in somebody else's oven, at scale, with a fire running all day. Butter or dripping, which requires no heat at all. And tea, which requires exactly one thing, and that thing is boiling water. The reason a whole country ended up drinking tea is not a story about the East. It is a story about the size of a grate and the price of coal. The machine reached into the kitchen and rewrote the menu, and it did it through the fuel line. I've had you sitting in the household's chair for 20 minutes, doing its arithmetic. I'm taking you out of that chair now, because the next cost is not one anybody can be asked to budget for, and it would be indecent to pretend otherwise. The costs so far have all been bills. Things that arrive with a price attached, which a family can see, resent, and try to manage. The real cost of this transition was never a bill. It was a subtraction, something removed, quietly and completely, with no invoice issued and nobody to complain to. It came in 3 layers, and each one is harder to escape than the one above it. The first layer is the village's second income, the one that never appeared in any account book because it was never paid in money. Fuel gathered from waste ground and hedgerow, grain gleaned from a field after harvest, a cow or a few geese kept on common land, a garden. This was not a charming supplement. For a laboring family, it was the difference between a bad year and a catastrophe. Parliamentary enclosure removed it, and it removed, specifically and disproportionately, the rights that women and children were the main users of. The household lost its independent producers before it ever gained a second wage. That layer can be replaced with money, and it was. It just costs more than it used to. The second layer is harder, because money buys it badly. Someone still has to mind the infant while the mother is at the mill. In the towns, what was actually available at the price a mill wage could pay was a paid minder with too many children in her care, and a bottle. Godfrey's cordial was opium and syrup, sold openly, and it worked exactly as advertised. It kept an infant quiet for a shift. Contemporary observers in Manchester claimed the habit reached most working households and described druggists selling it by the gallon. Those claims are testimony, not measurement, and they should be held as testimony. But they were made by people looking directly at it, and they were made repeatedly, by people with nothing to gain. The third layer cannot be bought back at any price. In the largest British cities in the 1830s and 1840s, life expectancy at birth fell below 30 years. The sanitary inquiry that shocked Parliament in 1842 put it more brutally than any average could. The mean age at death of a laborer in Manchester came out at 17, against 52 for the gentry of rural Rutlandshire. We will come back to how much weight that particular pair of numbers can carry, because it cannot carry all of it. But the direction was never in dispute, and it was not a secret. The towns paid more, and the towns killed faster. And the second fact was, in a sense, nobody had language for the reason for the first. It never appeared as an expense. It appeared as an absence, as years that simply did not happen, to people who were never told that this was the trade. And in 1837, the state began registering every death in England by name, by place, and by cause. Somebody wrote it down. Something then arrives that this arrangement cannot survive, and it is worth being precise about what it was, because the obvious answer is wrong. The wrong question is, what changed? Did people become kinder? Did reformers finally win the argument? Everything is always changing, and there had been reformers shouting about this for 40 years without result. The right question is narrower and more useful. Why could this particular arrangement not absorb the thing that arrived? It had absorbed a great deal already. It had absorbed hunger, cholera, machine breaking, strikes, mass petitions, and a genuine fear of revolution. Those were shocks it was built to take. What it could not take was arithmetic. Within a few years, in a country that had never had any of it, an apparatus of measurement simply appeared. Civil registration of every birth and death from 1837. Statistical societies in Manchester and London, whose members were largely the manufacturers themselves, methodically counting sellers, wages, deaths, and school attendance. A factory inspectorate with the legal power to walk through a locked gate. A national sanitary inquiry in 1842 that gathered the numbers together and printed them. Look closely at who built it. The Manchester Statistical Society, formed in 1833, was the first body of its kind in the country, and it was founded and funded by the town's own merchants and manufacturers, who sent agents door to door through the working districts to count what was actually in the houses. At the General Register Office, the work of turning raw death entries into a usable classification of causes was done by a medical statistician who understood, earlier than almost anyone, that a table of deaths arranged by district was an instrument and not a formality. None of these people were revolutionaries. Most of them were the machine's beneficiaries. And here is why that was fatal, rather than merely embarrassing. This apparatus did not arrive from outside the machine, sent by people who hated it. It was the machine's own habit, turned around and pointed back at it. A system that runs on cash payment must count. It cannot function otherwise. Wages have to be calculated, so hours have to be recorded. Rents have to be collected, so tenancies have to be listed. Output has to be priced, so output has to be weighed. Everything that made the industrial town work required somebody, somewhere, to keep a book. The men who built the counting habit were not the reformers. They were the mill owners, the landlords, the shopkeepers, and the accountants. And they built it because without it, none of them could get paid. Hold that shape in your mind. A system whose entire strength depends on writing things down. Because we are about to find the same property sitting at the exact center of the machine. The thing that made this machine powerful and the thing that destroyed its impunity are not two properties. They are one property, seen from two sides of who is holding the pen. The power was the conversion. Everything a household needed to stay alive was pulled out of the family and turned into a purchasable quantity. Bread by the loaf, coal by the hundredweight, cloth by the yard. An hour of an infant's silence by the bottle. And labor itself, by the hour. That conversion is not an unpleasant side effect of industrial capitalism. It is the thing itself. It is what allowed a country to reorganize its entire population around where production was most efficient rather than where food happened to grow. Now look at the same property from the other side. The moment a thing carries a price, it acquires a counterparty. A village family that ate short in a bad year had been failed by weather, and you cannot summon weather. A town family that bought a short loaf had been failed by a transaction, and a transaction has a seller, with a name and a street address, which is precisely why printing those addresses was possible and why it worked. The moment a thing carries a price, it acquires a standard. Adulteration is only an offense where there is an agreed thing being sold. Nobody can adulterate the food you grew yourself. They can only adulterate the food you bought. And the deepest one is the hour, which is the same one again. In the village, the day was a set of tasks you worked until the thing was done, and the length of the day was a fact about the job and the light. In the town, the bell converted the day into a quantity. That is what made it sellable, and it had to be sellable for any of this to function. But a quantity is measurable, and a measurable thing is a disputable thing. You cannot argue about how long a day is when a day is, however long the work takes. You can argue about it forever once it is 58 hours a week. Every labor struggle of the next century is an argument inside that single unit, not about whether work should exist, about where the boundary of the purchased quantity falls. So here is the law this machine runs on, and it has nothing to do with looms or coal or the 19th century. A system that forces you to buy what you used to make draws all of its power from that conversion, and in the same motion, it hands you the measuring stick that will be used against it. It cannot take the first without giving the second. The dependency and the evidence are the same act. The registers, the inspections, the budget columns, the tables of deaths, none of that could have existed in a world of self-provisioning households, because there would have been nothing to record. The machine made its subjects legible in order to pay them, and once they were legible, somebody wrote it down. Which brings us to the Monday. In June 1847, after a campaign lasting a generation, Parliament passed the 10 Hours Act. From the 1st of July that year, women and young persons in textile mills could be worked 63 hours a week. From the 1st of May 1848, the 10-hour day, at last, in law. What happened next is the part that should be famous and isn't. The act limited the hours a protected worker could be employed. It did not repeal the older provision, allowing a mill to operate across a 15-hour span of the day. So the mills stopped running their protected workers in a block and started running them in relays. 2 hours on, 1 hour off, in shifts staggered through the day, so that women and young persons drifted in and out of the building while the machinery and the adult men tending it ran for 14 or 15 hours without stopping. Consider what this did to enforcement. An inspector, arriving unannounced at any moment of the day, would walk into a room where every single person present was legally employed. The offense was not visible in the room. The offense existed only across the whole day, in the pattern. And the pattern lived in a set of books the inspector had to reconstruct. The inspectorate took it to court. The test case was heard at the beginning of 1850, and they lost. The relays were held to be lawful. And then, later that same year, came the settlement, and it is the strangest compromise in the history of British labor law. Because on its face, the workers gave ground. The weekly limit went up. 58 hours became 60. 2 hours a week, handed back. In exchange, they got a boundary. The working day was fixed to lie between 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, with the mill required to stop at a set hour. Relays did not become illegal. Relays became arithmetically impossible. There was no longer enough day to hide them in. The 10-hour day was not won by winning an argument about how many hours a person should work. It was won by winning an argument about which 12 hours of the clock face those hours were allowed to sit inside. And 4 years earlier, there had been a smaller version of the same fight, easy to miss in the statute book. A clause requiring that a factory's timekeeping follow a public clock, approved by an inspector. It is there because it had to be there, because whoever owned the clock owned the day, and Parliament had been forced to legislate on the question of whose clock was real. The strongest case against everything you have just heard deserves stating properly. That figure of 17 is not a life expectancy, and anyone who presents it as one is misleading you. It is a mean age at death, and it is dragged down brutally by infant mortality and by the age structure of a city packed with young migrants. Historians have been sharp about it, and they are right to be. The wider claim that urban life expectancy collapsed below 30 in these decades has itself been directly challenged in recent years on the strength of better parish data. And the economist who first tried to price the urban risk premium, putting it somewhere between 8 and 30% of the wage, later conceded the 19th century evidence looked far weaker than that range implies. Take all of it. Every one of those objections is about magnitude. Not one of them is about direction. No historian argues that the manufacturing towns of the 1840s were healthier than the countryside people were leaving, and none of it touches the statute book. Parliament does not fix a clock face by law to solve a problem that isn't there. So why did it take until 1850, when the evidence had been in front of everyone for decades? Not because nobody knew. They knew. The reports had been printed, debated, and read aloud in the Commons. Reform had been proposed continuously since the 1810s. The obstacle was not ignorance, and it was not simple cruelty. It was that at every level of this system, the rational move for an individual was the suicidal move for everyone. A mill owner who shortened his own hours did not become a better employer. He became an uncompetitive one. Almost all of his cost was sunk in machinery and buildings, which cost the same whether they ran 10 hours or 15, and he was selling into a market where the price was set by whoever ran longest. Going first meant losing, and losing meant the mill closed and the hands went hungry, which is exactly the argument the manufacturers made, and it was not a lie. A family that refused to send a child to the mill was not making a moral stand that anyone would see. It was falling behind on rent that week, in a town where falling behind on rent meant the street. This is why the answer had to be a law rather than a conscience. A law arrives for everyone on the same morning. It removes the penalty for going first by abolishing the possibility of going first. The manufacturers who fought hardest against the 10 Hours Act were not, for the most part, arguing that children should work 15 hours. They were arguing that they personally could not afford to be the one who stopped. And the instruments needed to enforce any of it did not exist yet. There was no inspectorate until one was invented. There was no death registration until it was built. There were no food standards until somebody wrote them. Every tool that finally worked had to be constructed out of the wreckage first, by people who were improvising. And it is not a failure of character to be missing a tool that has not been made. Strip out the coal and the cotton and the dates, and the law is still standing. Whenever a system converts something you used to do into something you buy, two things happen at once, and they cannot be separated. You lose the ability to survive outside the transaction, that is the dependency. And the transaction generates a record, that is the evidence. The price is legible from the first day. The loss is not legible for a generation. But the same ledger that measures your dependence is the only instrument that will ever be able to prove what it cost you. You will recognize the shape. It runs anywhere a capability leaves the household and comes back as a subscription. A service, a fee where a thing people used to simply do becomes a thing people pay for, monthly, and where the monthly figure is perfectly clear while the thing that was given up has no number at all. The arithmetic of that trade is never available at the moment the trade is made. It arrives later, in somebody's data. Which brings us back to the families in that Manchester accountant's ledger. They did everything correctly. They went where the work was. They sent more of the household out to earn, exactly as the century advised. They spent almost nothing on anything that was not survival. And the columns still barely close because the money coming in was not a gain, It was a replacement, and it was replacing things that had never had a price at all. We can say anything about them only because a man with a notebook decided their weekly bread was worth recording. There is no other trace, and that is not a footnote. That is the mechanism. The counting that made them dependent is the counting that makes them visible to us now, and it is the same counting that finally forced the change. The record was never on their side or against them. It was simply the only thing that survived. Industrial workers were not paid more for the same life. They were paid more for a different one and a shorter one. Same law, different machine. Next time, the thing being converted is not bread or fuel or an hour of the afternoon. It is the ground under an entire country, and the ledger that proves what it cost is one that nobody was ever supposed to read.